So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Jiru country, where I live and work, and pay my respects to the elders. I also acknowledge all the lesbians who fought for the freedom of women and lesbians in the last couple of centuries, sometimes at the cost of their lives. I want to begin with a quote from my book, Vortex. Rape, torture, silence, shame and hatred, all combined so that no one ever hears of the violations of lesbians' human rights. It's invisible. It's as if it doesn't exist, just as lesbians don't exist. So as Bronwyn said, I've been writing about lesbians since 1975. In 1976, I wrote In Defence of Separatism, and that remained unpublished in full until 2019. In that, I wrote about heterosexuality as an institution in a section called Things Peculiar to Women's Oppression. As well as heterosexuality, I included rape and romantic love. Towards the end of the book, I outlined how lesbian feminism is important to feminist political successes. Even I'm surprised at how often and how much I've written about lesbians. But my guess is that the vast majority of these writings across fiction, poetry and non-fiction is pretty unknown, certainly in the mainstream. It's not just the bad things that happen to lesbians that are invisible and erased. It's also the marvellous and wonderful things lesbians have achieved. When colonisers conquer a land, their first reports back to empire usually contain something along the lines of, the natives possess no culture. This is a very fine way of excusing themselves for conquering and dispossessing other peoples. It also excuses their future actions of imposing their own culture and their own values on the colonised peoples for their own good. Eventually, the colonised begin to believe the lies they are told by the colonisers and so are submerged again in the imperial culture at which they have to excel in order to get along in the world. I actually wrote that back in 2003 in an editorial for The Age, which I had forgotten. It wasn't published, of course. Lesbians remain colonised, and in the current era, lesbians are recolonised by the self-IDing of men who call themselves women and even lesbians. Language has been weaponised by the trans lobby, and just last week on the Johns Hopkins University website, a lesbian was defined as a non-man attracted to non-men. It has now been taken down, but no doubt because many lesbians protested this vociferously. In my talk tonight, I want to talk on the terrible and the terrific, but I'm going to begin first with the terrible. In 2002, I was at a World Women's Congress in Uganda. Towards the end, there was a session on radical feminism in Africa, so I went to listen. I asked a question about lesbians. After the session, a woman approached me and said, "Be careful, be very careful. In this country, they torture lesbians." Her name was Christine. I sat with this sentence for a long time and decided that I needed to know more. I began my search for evidence of lesbians who were tortured. The most important essay I read was by Consuelo Rivera Fuentes and Linda Burke, published in 2001. There are very few first-person accounts of the torture of lesbians. Consuelo was tortured during the Pinochet regime in Chile, and they intensified the torture because they knew she was a lesbian. I knew her only through this article, but subsequently we met and became friends. I also found information on the torture of lesbians in Uganda in a book published by Amnesty International in 2001. But here it was already evident that lesbians were nowhere near as important as gay men and transsexuals who took up most of the book. Over the next 15 years, I continued to search for material on lesbians who are murdered, raped and tortured. And I document what I found in my book, Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy. I was also writing a novel, Dark Matters, in which two lesbians are attacked in a pre-dawn raid one is arrested and the other shot. It's a book about the ways in which lesbians are violated, but also about how our stories are disappeared. It's also about love and commitment, memory and imagination, misunderstanding and misrepresentations. It tells of the resilience of lesbians. When I joined the women's liberation movement in 1973, two of the things that inspired and sustained me were poetry and art. Throughout the last 50-odd years, I've admired the artworks of lesbians like Suzanne Bellamy, singer-songwriter Alex Dobkin, as well as bands, theatres, circus, and a huge range of poets. I remain an avid reader and have attempted to add my own words to this lesbian culture. And between the projects listed above, I wrote 6 collections of poetry which celebrate lesbian lives, as well as storytelling and prehistory. I quite frequently invent gatherings of lesbians that cross time zones because you can get away with this in poetry. The books include The Butterfly Effect, Unsettling the Land with Suzanne Bellamy, Cow, Lehman, Blueprint Lamb, and The Sacking of the Muses. I mention this because the creation of lesbian culture is critical to our survival and to a thriving cultural and political epoch. Just as lesbians at the turn of the 19th and 20th century through to post-World War II era created so many works that we can relish today. Lesbian history tends to work diagonally through aunts and nieces, mentors and apprentices, through communities of like-minded women. This is why lesbian spaces are so important, so that we can come together, talk and argue, sing and dance and have extraordinary experiences, such as the lesbian concert in the Sydney Opera House at the end of the Lesbian Festival in 1991. Thank you, Bronwyn, for stage managing that event. I only found that out last week. The trans attack on lesbians began in the 1980s and has picked up enormously since then, with billionaires funding medical transition, media whitewash, legal fictions and more. In the meantime, lesbians are unfunded and not advocated for because, as Gillian Hanscom writes, no one is proud of dykes, only other dykes are proud of dykes. That's from her book, Sybil, The Glide of Her Tongue. It's published by Spinifex. The next session is about lesbians versus the TQ plus brigade. I want to speak about several personal experiences here that I've had that have helped me deepen my thinking about the trans lobby. I was a member of the Melbourne Women's Circus when, in April 2000, a trans woman in inverted quotes wrote and asked if he could join the Women's Circus. Circus is a place of physical and emotional trust. There is bodily intimacy and balances and double aerials acts. Over the next 6 months, his application was talked about by members of the circus. And to my knowledge, no other applicant was ever accorded this privilege. It was a privilege because in the past, membership was either accepted or denied, no discussion. In his case, there were clear boundaries for denying it. He was not a woman who had been subjected to sexual abuse or rape as a woman. The issue of boundaries was raised, to which I answered in an open letter that I wrote. Women living outside the state of Victoria are not permitted to join. Women under the age of 18 are not permitted to join. So I asked, is the boundary woman any less difficult to define than these rather arbitrary boundaries which are already in place? From 2017 to 2020, I did research on my book, Vortex. I have to say that the most difficult chapter in this book was the one I called Breaking the Spirit of the Women's Liberation Movement, the War Against Biology. Difficult because the material at that time was so contradictory. It was Jennifer Bilek whose articles pointed me to the billionaires and organisations like Dentons and Reuters that helped me make sense of the huge forces set against us. Throughout the book, I have a section on money trails in all but the introduction. And so among the money trails are the medical industrial complex making profits from people with disabilities alongside eugenic policies, Soros and other libertarians decriminalising prostitution, info and biotech companies such as Bill Gates and Monsanto and Bayer, profiting in the area of bioprospecting, patent foods and GMOs, the deterritorialisation of Indigenous peoples, the colonised and ongoing practices of slavery have reaped huge profits for colonial empires. The trans billionaires and big pharma who are making huge profits from the trans industry, and the fossil fuel miners, IT companies and eugenicists who are in climate denial and climate profit. Lesbians are targeted by the trans industry, but there isn't even a pretense that money should go to lesbians unless they're a subset of LGBTQ+. Any externally well-funded lesbian organisation, I have to mention Australia here, is, in my view, suspect. Lesbians have to raise all the funds from our own projects, such as Matrix Guild in Melbourne. My final example comes from an interaction I had with the International Alliance of Independent Publishers based in Paris, an organisation Spinifex has been a member of since 2007, and for 4 years I was the English language coordinator and on the governing board. In April 2022, the Alliance decided that the long-standing feminist section should be called the Feminist and LGBTQ+ section, without discussion with feminist publisher members. I said this was like suggesting Monsanto should join the ecology section. One of the principles of the Alliance is decolonisation. I protested and pointed out that feminists and TQ+ lobby have nothing in common and completely different objectives. I mentioned 3 billionaires, John Stryker, Jennifer, in quotes, Pritzker and Peter Buffett, and wrote the following about the transgender lobby and its billionaire funders. When same-sex marriages laws were being fought for, these billionaires gave huge amounts of money, and it meant that the T had to be added to the LGB. This creates a system of astroturfing, a very 21st century means of advocacy. Organisations mask their sources of funding to appear to be a grassroots organisation, just as AstroTurf is fake grass. Astroturfing refers to organisations that are fake grassroots, that is, phony movements. These billionaires are responsible for a huge increase in visibility and funding to trans organisations. They've been supported by the UN, who are mostly following the Yogyakarta principles, which are not ratified by the UN, but they're treated as if they are. They contradict CEDAW, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, by presenting intergenerational sex, that is pedophilia, as a freedom. I was unsuccessful in changing the Alliance policy, and while we remain members, we are trying to slowly talk with other feminist publishers to encourage them to be brave. To their credit, the Alliance did attempt to discuss the issue further with us, but they seem not to understand the gravity of the situation for women, for lesbians, and for feminist publishers. At the time of speaking with them, there were no T publishers, but they still preferred to have a welcoming LGBTQ+ section than to support the feminist publishers already active in the organisation. I also pointed them to the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, informing them of the signatories from countries around the world. None of this had any impact because we are meant to be kind even to our oppressors. Every lesbian who is aware of the consequences of these policies, of the hatred implicit and explicit at the root of the TQ+ lobby, is up against a huge, well-funded marketing campaign with governmental and UN support, with rare exceptions such as Reem Al-Salem, the UN reporter on violence against women and girls, with legal and organisational clout. As lesbians, we have to fight this if we are to have a place for the next generation of lesbians. I want to finish with 2 short quotes, one from my novel Dark Matters. I cry for all the women, for all the lesbians, because no one cries for us. And finally, from Nicole Brossard's book, The Aerial Letter, a lesbian who does not reinvent the world is a lesbian in the process of disappearing. Thank you.